The plant manager's voice echoed across the cramped office. "You are a damn screw-up, Jason." Jason Miller stood in front of the metal desk, staring at the floor. In his hands, he slowly twisted a worn-out work glove, the leather creaking softly. He didn't argue. He rarely did. He was 32 years old, but lately it felt like his life had already ended. Just a few years earlier, he had finally moved out of his mother's small apartment and tried to start over. Back then, he believed things might change, that he might eventually build something resembling a normal life. But Jason had always been the kind of man who stayed quiet in the background. Kind, harmless, too hesitant. While his old classmates bought houses, raised kids, drove new SUVs, or moved overseas chasing better jobs, Jason stayed exactly where he had always been, working at Riverside Industrial Steel, machining parts in Workshop 51, and thinking too much. That morning had been no different. He had been standing at the milling machine, the loud whine of cutting steel filling the air, when suddenly a memory hit him like a wave. Her, blonde hair moving in the wind, a soft voice that once made his chest tighten. Emily. For a moment, he had stopped paying attention. Just one moment. The metal part slipped from the cutter. The spinning blade caught it and threw it like a bullet into the housing of a brand new transformer unit. Sparks exploded. Smoke filled the station. The fire suppression system triggered instantly, but the damage was already done. By the time the shift ended, everyone in the workshop knew. And now the manager was yelling. "You're useless, Jason," the man shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. "People like you shouldn't even be here. What are you anyway? Some psychology graduate? A lawyer? One of those useless degrees nobody needs." Jason said nothing. The man jabbed a finger toward the door.
"This country needs workers, not weak little idiots who daydream at machines." He opened a drawer, took out a small bottle of pills, shook one into his hand, and swallowed it dry. Jason finally lifted his eyes. "Mr. Carter," he said quietly. The manager paused. Jason continued, his voice still calm. "You've never worked a machine in your life." The room fell silent. "You only got this job because your cousin owns half the plant. That's what people say." For a moment, Mr. Carter froze. His face slowly changed color, pale, then red, then a strange, sick green. Then he exploded. "You little bastard." The chair crashed backward as he jumped to his feet. "Get out! Get the hell out of my factory!" He stormed around the desk, yanked the door open, and shoved Jason into the hallway. "And don't come back for a week. Go take a medical evaluation or something, you useless wreck." The door slammed shut. Jason stood there for a moment, staring at the gray industrial corridor. This wasn't the first time. Mr. Carter happened to be an old acquaintance of Jason's mother, which was probably the only reason he hadn't been fired permanently. Usually, Jason just got suspended for a few days until everyone cooled down. He walked back through the workshop floor, emptied his locker, and left through the front gate. Outside, the daylight felt blinding. The huge steel structures of the plant shimmered in the early spring heat. The air smelled like oil, rust, and smoke. Jason shoved his hands into his pockets and started walking. He didn't want to go home. The apartment felt empty since his mother died 2 years ago. The TV always hummed quietly in the background, but the silence still felt heavy. So he just walked. Eventually, he reached Riverside Park, a quiet place near the old lake. Early spring was the worst time of year. The weather couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Sun one moment, cold wind the next. Patches of melting snow turned the pathways into muddy slush. Dirty water pooled in cracks in the pavement. Jason made his way toward the far end of the lake. There was a small fenced area there where 2 white swans usually lived. They were still there,
gliding slowly through the murky water. The lake's surface looked oily, thin trash floating near the edges. Plastic bottles, soggy leaves from last autumn, fragments of melting ice. It looked exactly the same as it had a year ago. This was where he had first seen her, Emily. She had been standing by the railing, tossing pieces of bread into the water. Her hair was the color of wheat fields in summer, slightly tangled by the wind. Her eyes were dark and deep, the kind you could stare into for too long. Her skin pale with a faint blush, like milk with a drop of strawberry. At least that's how Jason remembered it. Back then, he had stood behind her for almost 10 minutes, trying to gather the courage to speak. His heart pounded like it was trying to escape his chest. Finally, he forced himself to say something incredibly stupid. "Isn't that bread kind of wasted on swans?" She turned and smiled, and somehow the conversation started. It had been easy, warm, natural. After that, Jason began coming to the park more often. Sometimes they walked around the lake, sometimes they sat on a bench and talked about everything. Movies, childhood memories, plans for the future. Emily was younger than him, optimistic, always dreaming. She talked about studying abroad. Her parents had money. They had already planned everything. Jason listened and nodded, pretending to be happy for her. But inside, something twisted painfully. What could he offer her? A rented apartment with 2 months of unpaid rent? A factory job barely covering groceries? No future. When she finally left the country, Jason felt like something had been ripped out of his chest. Now he stood in the same place again, staring at the dirty water.
Idiot, he muttered under his breath. Idiot for never telling her how he felt. Idiot for wasting his life. He turned and left the park. An idea suddenly appeared in his mind. His mother. Her grave. He hadn't visited in months. So he took a bus to the cemetery on the edge of the city. By the time he arrived, the sun was already dropping toward the horizon. The cemetery paths were soft with melting mud. Wet branches cracked under his boots. It took him almost half an hour to find the grave. The grass had grown wild. The wooden cross leaned slightly to one side. The inscription was fading. Jason sat down on the cold ground. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he began talking quietly. About the factory, about getting suspended again, about Emily, about how tired he was. "Mom, I miss you," he whispered. The wind moved softly through the trees. He stayed there until the sky turned dark. Eventually, he stood up and stopped by the caretaker's shed near the gate. The old man gave him the number of someone who could replace the broken fence around the grave. Jason promised he would call. When he finally walked out of the cemetery, the moon had already risen high. The pale light covered the gravestones in silver. Cold air drifted along the empty paths. Jason shoved his hands into his pockets and headed toward the gate. Then he heard a voice behind him. "Hey, kid! Hold up!" Jason turned. A thin man stood near the trees. Dirty jacket, unshaven face, red nose. The kind of guy who looked like he hadn't had a proper home in years. "Sorry?" Jason said cautiously. "Need a hand?" the man said. "There's a grave not far from here. The cross fell over. My back's not what it used to be." He scratched his beard and smiled weakly. "Help me lift it back up, will you? I'll owe you one." Jason hesitated. Something about the situation felt strange, but the man's voice sounded calm, friendly. Jason shrugged. "All right." They walked deeper into the cemetery. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The paths twisted between old monuments and thick bushes. Jason started to feel uneasy. Finally, the man stopped near a low stone structure half buried in the ground. A mausoleum. "Here," the man said. Jason crouched and looked into the dark entrance.
A faint orange glow flickered below. Firelight. "Well, okay," Jason muttered, and he climbed down after the man. The air inside smelled like smoke and something sour. The chamber was larger than it looked from above. Old mattresses lay scattered across the floor, empty cans, dirty blankets. Jason frowned. Homeless people. From the darkness, a voice suddenly spoke. "Oh, good. You finally brought one." Jason turned. Something smashed into the back of his head, and the world went black. Pain was the first thing that came back. Not a normal pain. At first, it was dull, distant, like something pressing deep inside his body. Then it exploded into something sharp and unbearable, ripping through his nerves like fire. Jason tried to breathe. The air smelled foul. Smoke, urine, rot. His chest shuddered with weak gasps. For a few seconds, he didn't understand where he was. Then memory returned. The cemetery, the strange man, the mausoleum. Jason tried to move. His body didn't respond. A wave of panic surged through him. He attempted to lift his arm, but it barely twitched. The darkness slowly adjusted in his eyes. A tiny candle burned somewhere nearby, its flame trembling. And then he saw the tools. A rusted hacksaw, a hammer, a long kitchen knife with a chipped wooden handle. Something wet covered the stone floor. Rags, dark, soaked. Jason followed the trail with his eyes and froze. Where his legs should have been, there was nothing. Below his knees, both legs were gone. Just thick bundles of filthy cloth wrapped around bloody stumps. For a moment, his mind refused to accept what he was seeing.
Then the pain hit him again. A raw scream tried to tear its way out of his throat, but it came out as a broken wheeze. Jason tried to lift himself up. His body shifted slightly, and something rolled beside him. He looked. His arm. His own severed arm lay on the floor in the shadows. Jason's lungs seized. He tried to scream again, but terror crushed his voice. "Hey," he croaked weakly. "Anyone there?" Laughter answered him. Raspy, wet, drunken. From behind a cracked stone wall stepped the same man who had asked for help above the cemetery. Up close, he looked even worse. Greasy hair, filthy coat, eyes cloudy and empty. Behind him came another man, thicker, bearded, with a burn scar across his cheek. He carried a metal bowl. "Well, look at that," the bearded one said with a crooked grin. "Still alive." He crouched beside Jason and tore a chunk of meat from the bowl. Jason stared at it, his stomach twisted. The man shoved it into his mouth and chewed slowly, watching Jason the entire time. He muttered. "Fresh." Jason realized what it was. His body convulsed violently. The first man chuckled. "Told you he'd last longer," he said. "Strong one." Jason tried to move again, tried to drag himself away, but his strength was gone. The bearded man leaned closer. "We've been hungry," he said casually. "Real hungry." He took another bite. "You were a lucky find." Jason tried to scream. The first man stepped forward and shoved a filthy rag into his mouth. "Quiet," he muttered. "You'll bleed out if you panic too much, and we still got the rest of the night." He grabbed Jason's wrists and tied them tightly with dirty rope. Then he spat directly onto Jason's chest. The other man uncorked a bottle of cloudy alcohol and took a long swallow. He staggered forward, laughing. Then he unzipped his pants and urinated on Jason. "Look at you,"
he slurred. King of life. The two men roared with laughter. Their voices echoed against the stone walls. Eventually, they wandered toward the small fire burning in the corner. They talked quietly for a while. Then the metal door above the stairs slammed shut. Their footsteps faded. Silence returned. Jason lay there alone. The smell of blood filled his lungs. Every breath was agony. His mind drifted through broken fragments. His mother's voice, Emily's smile, the sound of the milling machine at the factory, the normal world, the world that now felt impossibly far away. His fingers twitched weakly. To his surprise, they moved. Slowly, painfully, but they moved. Jason dragged his body forward. The ropes cut into his wrists as he pulled himself across the cold stone floor. Blood smeared behind him. He knocked over the bottle of alcohol. It spilled across his chest and open wounds. The pain that followed was blinding. Jason gasped like a dying animal. But he didn't stop. "No," he whispered. "Not here." His fingers scraped against the stone wall as he dragged himself toward the staircase. Tears blurred his vision. Somewhere deep inside his chest, something else began to stir. Something dark, something furious. He wasn't ready to die. Not like this. Even without legs. Even in this hell. Above him, the wind moaned across the cemetery. Far away, a freight train thundered through the night. Moonlight poured across the gravestones above. And deep beneath the ground, inside the ancient mausoleum, Jason Miller kept breathing. Slow, broken, but stubborn. Alive. He pulled himself closer to the stairs. His hands slipped in his own blood. Just a few more feet, then footsteps above him. Voices, laughter. The door creaked open. Light spilled down the staircase. "Well, look at that," one of the men said. "Hero tried to escape." They grabbed him under the arms and dragged him back across the floor.
Jason's body left a thick red trail behind him. They threw him into the corner beside the dying fire. The air felt even heavier now. One of them picked up an old axe. The blade was dull and rusted. He began sharpening it slowly with a metal file. The screeching sound filled the chamber. "Well," the man muttered, not even looking at Jason. "Time to finish the job." The other laughed. "Been a while since we had warm meat." Jason tried to speak. Nothing came out. He could only stare at the axe as its edge began to shine in the firelight. Then, clap. A slow, deliberate sound echoed from the staircase. Clap, clap, clap. The men froze. A woman's voice drifted down from above. Cold, confident. "Well," she said, "this is disgusting." Both men turned. A woman stood on the stairs. Short, dark hair, red lipstick, black leather jacket, high heels clicking softly against the stone. Her hands were empty, but something about the way she stood made the air feel heavier. One of the men whistled. "Well, look at that," he grinned. "Tonight's a feast." The other laughed loudly. "Food and a woman delivered right to us." But the laughter didn't last long, because the woman moved. Fast. So fast, Jason barely saw it. Her hand shot forward. It punched straight through the chest of the nearest man. Bone cracked. Blood exploded across the wall. The man collapsed instantly. The second barely had time to shout before her foot snapped upward. His neck twisted at a horrifying angle. The third lunged with a knife. She caught his wrist, twisted.
The blade drove directly into his eye. Silence returned. 3 bodies lay motionless on the floor. The woman stood among them, breathing slowly. She wiped her hand on the dead man's jacket. Then she walked toward Jason. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. She stopped beside him and looked down. "Well," she said calmly, "found you too late." Her eyes examined the bloody stumps where his legs had been. She clicked her tongue softly. "Still," she raised her hand.
She raised her hand and paused for a moment. Then she looked at Jason. "Drink," she said quietly. Jason looked at her, confused and exhausted. A few dark drops fell onto his chest. His mind could barely keep up with what was happening. Pain and fatigue had drained nearly all of his strength. At some point, he stopped trying to understand. His lips moved. He drank. The taste was unusual, warm. As the liquid moved through him, a powerful wave of heat spread across his body. His heart began beating faster. Something deep inside him seemed to wake up, moving through every part of him like a sudden surge of energy. Jason let out a weak cry. The room seemed to shift around him. Everything slowly faded. The last thing he heard was her voice, soft, almost gentle. "You won't die now," she said quietly, "but life will feel very different from this moment on." Then everything disappeared into darkness. When Jason opened his eyes again, the world was silent. No voices, no footsteps. Only the faint smell of damp stone and old ashes in the air. For a long moment, he didn't move. A dull pressure echoed in his head, like a distant vibration. Then the memories returned. The cemetery, the men, the woman. Jason suddenly sat up. The movement was instinctive, and the first thing he noticed was the absence of pain. He froze. Slowly, he looked down. His legs were there, both of them, whole. His hands trembled as he touched his knees, then his calves, then his ankles. Skin, warm, alive. He lifted his shirt and looked at his chest. Everything looked normal. No marks, no signs of injury. His shirt was still torn and stained, but the skin underneath looked untouched. Jason's breathing became shallow. "This isn't possible," he whispered. Carefully, he stood up. For a moment, his balance felt strange, as if his body was remembering how to move again. But within seconds, the strength returned. The mausoleum looked different now. The old mattresses were gone. The scattered trash had disappeared. Even the people who had been there earlier were nowhere to be seen. Only the remains of a small fire were left in the center of the room, and a few dark marks remained on the stone floor. Jason slowly turned in a circle. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The silence felt deep and unnatural. Nothing made sense. "Hello?" he called. His voice echoed softly through the chamber. No answer. He climbed the stairs cautiously. The metal door at the top creaked as he pushed it open. Cold night air rushed into his lungs. The cemetery stretched before him, quiet and empty beneath the moon. For a second, Jason simply stood there. Then he began walking. At first slowly, then faster. By the time he reached the cemetery gates, he was almost running. By morning, he was sitting in his apartment kitchen. The electric kettle hissed softly on the stove. The fluorescent light flickered above the table. Jason sat motionless, staring at nothing. His mind tried to piece the night together. Maybe it had been a hallucination, a concussion, shock. Maybe he had imagined everything. The kettle clicked off. Steam curled into the air. Jason stood up and walked toward the window. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. He pulled them aside. The bright morning light hit his face. He squinted. but nothing happened. No burning, no smoke. His skin looked completely normal. Jason frowned. He moved to the mirror in the hallway. The reflection staring back at him looked the same as always. Pale face, dark circles under his eyes, 3-day stubble. Just Jason. He exhaled slowly. "Okay," he muttered. "So I'm just losing my mind." The exhaustion finally caught up with him. He collapsed onto his bed and fell asleep almost instantly. 3 weeks passed. Life returned to its usual dull rhythm. Work, home, sleep. Jason forced himself not to think about that night. Sometimes he woke up sweating after strange dreams, but by morning they faded into vague memories. Eventually, he convinced himself it had all been a nightmare. Until the accident. The workshop floor was louder than usual that day. A rush order had everyone working double shifts. Machines screamed. Metal shards flew like sparks. Jason stood at his milling station, focused on the spinning cutter. His hands moved automatically. The same routine he had performed thousands of times.
Hey, Jason, someone shouted from across the floor. Greg wants you in the office.
Jason turned his head for just a second. That was all it took. The rotating cutter caught his glove. In the blink of an eye, the machine dragged his hand into the spinning blades. There was a wet crunch. Jason looked down. For a second, his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. His hand was gone. Not cut, not injured. Gone. The machine had shredded it into a mangled mass of bone and meat. Blood sprayed across the metal housing. Jason screamed. The sound tore out of his lungs like an animal. He ran. Through the workshop, through shouting coworkers, straight toward the medical station. He kicked the door open and collapsed onto the floor. "Help!" he gasped. "Please!" No one was inside. The room was empty. Jason grabbed a roll of bandages with his good hand. Then he froze. His fingers moved. All 5 of them. Jason slowly lifted his arm. His hand was there. Perfect. Clean. Uninjured. He stared at it, breathing rapidly. In his other hand, he still held something warm. He looked down. The shredded pieces of flesh were still clutched in his palm. His flesh. Jason dropped them. The wet chunks hit the floor with a soft slap. For a long moment he stood there, frozen. Then he slowly clenched both fists. His hands worked perfectly. Not even a scratch. He walked back toward the workshop entrance and looked at his machine. The bloodstains were still there. Real. Not imagined. Jason whispered to himself, "What the hell is happening to me?" And for the first time since the cemetery, he felt real fear. That night, he sat alone in his dark apartment. The lights were off. Only the city glow outside illuminated the room. Jason stared at the kitchen table. There was only one way to know. He opened the medicine cabinet and took out a needle. His hand trembled slightly. He pressed the needle deep into his fingertip. Jason decided to test what had happened to him. He gently touched his finger with a small needle. A tiny mark appeared on his skin. For a moment, he watched it closely. Then something strange happened. The mark slowly disappeared. His skin looked exactly the same as before. Jason stared at his finger in disbelief. A nervous laugh escaped him. "No way," he whispered. He stood up and walked toward the kitchen. For a moment, he simply stood there, thinking. Then he held his hand close to the warm light of the stove. The heat touched his skin, but something about it felt different. When he pulled his hand back and looked again, The skin appeared completely normal. Jason took a slow step backward. His heart was beating faster now. "This can't be real," he murmured. He returned to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. For a moment, he studied his reflection carefully. Then he tested again. A small mark appeared on his arm. But just like before, it faded almost immediately, as if his body was repairing itself faster than it should. Jason's breathing grew quicker. He tried again in different places. Each time the result was the same. The marks disappeared. The skin returned to normal. Again and again. Jason leaned closer to the mirror. "What if?" he whispered. Curiosity was beginning to replace fear. He touched his face carefully, studying every detail. For a brief moment, his vision blurred, but almost immediately, everything returned to normal again. He blinked several times. His reflection stared back at him. Perfectly healthy. Perfectly whole. Jason stood there in silence, looking at himself, trying to understand what he had become. And slowly, deep inside his mind, a new thought began to grow. Maybe whatever had happened to him that night had changed everything. He slowly slid down the bathroom wall and sat on the floor. His hands trembled, but not from fear. Deep inside him, something else had awakened, a dark curiosity. For the first time in his life, Jason Miller wanted to know where the limits were, if there were any at all. And somewhere far away in the darkness of the city, someone was already watching him. Jason didn't sleep that night. He sat on the kitchen floor until sunrise, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. Every few minutes, he would test them again. A needle, a knife, fire. Each time the same result. The wound appeared, then vanished. His body repaired itself instantly. No pain, no scars, no limits. At least, none he had discovered yet. But by morning, something else began to grow inside him. Hunger. Not normal hunger. It started as a dull emptiness in his stomach, but soon it turned into something sharper, burning, gnawing, like his body was demanding fuel. Jason checked his wallet. $32. Great. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The convenience store on the corner was open 24 hours. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Jason walked inside. He grabbed a cheap poppy seed roll and a small bottle of water from the shelf. The cashier barely looked at him. Jason paid. $3 left. Outside, the night air was cool and damp. Spring was trying to arrive, but winter still clung stubbornly to the streets. Jason walked slowly down the sidewalk, eating the roll. The hunger faded slightly, but something else remained. A strange, restless energy inside his chest. For most of his life, Jason had avoided trouble. He knew exactly how things worked. You didn't talk back. You didn't start fights. You kept your head down and survived. But tonight, something felt different. He turned down a side street. At the end of the block stood a small dive bar, the kind of place where broken neon signs flickered and fights happened every weekend. Outside, a car was parked crookedly near the entrance. Loud music blasted from the speakers. 5 people stood around it. 3 men, 2 women, all clearly drunk. One of the men leaned against the hood, laughing loudly. Another held a beer bottle and shouted something over the music. The third was enormous. Wide shoulders, thick arms, the kind of guy who solved problems with his fists. Jason stopped about 10 feet away. For a moment, he simply watched them. Then something inside him pushed forward. He walked closer. "Hey," he said calmly. The music kept blasting. No one responded. Jason raised his voice. "Hey!" Now they turned.
The big one squinted at him. "What?" Jason spoke clearly. "You're blasting music at 2 in the morning. People live here. Maybe turn it down." Silence fell. The women exchanged confused glances. One of the drunk men snorted. Then the big guy stepped forward. He smelled like alcohol and sweat. "Who the hell are you?" he said slowly. Jason met his eyes. Something in his voice changed. "Listen carefully," Jason said. "You and your drunk friends get in your car and leave." The group stared at him. Jason continued calmly. "Or I'll pull your lung out through your ass." The words came out quiet, almost casual, and somehow that made them more disturbing. For a second, nobody moved. The big man clenched his fists. He was at least 40 pounds heavier than Jason. "You got a death wish?" he asked. Jason didn't blink. They stared at each other. Something strange happened then. The big man's confidence faltered, just slightly. Something about Jason's expression felt wrong. There was no anger in it, no fear either, just a cold emptiness. The big man finally looked away. "Whatever," he muttered. He turned toward the car. "Everyone in the car, let's go." The others followed immediately. The women stumbled into the back seat. The engine started. Within seconds, the car disappeared down the street. Jason stood alone under the flickering streetlight.
He exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered, "that was new." He continued walking. Inside his chest, the strange cold feeling grew stronger. The next day, Jason returned to the factory. The machines roared. The same dull routine continued. During lunch break, he sat quietly at the table and tested his finger again under the table with a knife. The wound closed instantly. Across from him sat an old school acquaintance named Victor. Victor talked constantly about work, about management, about some shady deal the plant supervisors were trying to hide. Jason barely listened. Eventually, Victor stood up. "Well," he said, stretching, "let's hope this mess blows over. Otherwise, we're screwed." They shook hands. Jason left early that day. He didn't even care if the manager noticed. When he reached his apartment building, he heard shouting from the hallway. It was coming from the neighbor's apartment, Marina. She lived across the hall, always drinking, always loud, strange men coming and going at all hours. Jason had tolerated it for months. Tonight, something slammed into the wall so hard the building shook. Jason sighed. Unbelievable. He walked over and knocked on her door. The door opened halfway. Marina stood there. Her lip was split. Blood ran down her cheek. Her eyes looked dazed. "Yeah?" she muttered. Jason raised an eyebrow. "Wow," he said. "Some interesting hobbies you've got in there." She shrugged weakly. "Nothing, just arguing." Jason stepped past her into the apartment without asking. Inside the living room, 3 men sat around the table, empty bottles everywhere. The air smelled like alcohol and cigarettes. One of them looked up. "Who the hell is this?" Jason didn't answer. He walked closer, then suddenly kicked the nearest man directly in the face. The impact was brutal. The man flew backward and slammed into the radiator. 2 others jumped up instantly. "What the hell?" They tackled Jason. Within seconds, they had him pinned to the floor.
Fists and boots rained down on him. But Jason started laughing. Loud, uncontrolled. The blows landed again and again. His ribs cracked, his nose shattered, blood filled his mouth. But there was no pain. None. "Why's he laughing?" one of them shouted. "Shut him up!" They twisted his arms behind his back. The man Jason had kicked slowly got up, wiping blood from his mouth. His eyes burned with rage. He disappeared into the kitchen. When he returned, he held a knife.
Let's see how funny this is, he snarled. He drove the knife straight into Jason's stomach. The blade sank to the handle. Jason gasped and went limp. His body twitched. His eyes rolled back. The men froze. "Oh shit," one whispered. "Did you kill him?" They loosened their grip. Jason lay motionless, waiting. 3 seconds. 4. Then he stood up. The wound in his stomach sealed instantly. Jason slowly pulled the knife out. The room went silent. All 3 men stared at him in horror. Jason smiled, and something inside him finally snapped. He moved faster than they expected. The knife plunged under the ribs of the nearest man. Once, twice. Blood sprayed across the wall. The second man ran for the door. Jason grabbed him by the collar and slashed his throat. The third stumbled backward into the hallway and fled. Jason stood over the bodies, breathing heavily. He wiped the knife on his pants, then looked at Marina. She sat on the floor, drinking beer and staring at him in shock. Jason nodded politely. "Try to keep it quieter next time," he said calmly. Then he walked out and didn't stop walking. Jason didn't wait for the police. He walked straight back to his apartment, grabbed his passport, a few documents, and stuffed them into the inside pocket of his jacket. He hesitated for only a moment while looking around the small apartment. The place suddenly felt meaningless. The cheap furniture, the old TV, the cracked kitchen table. All of it belonged to a life that no longer existed.
Jason grabbed a backpack, shoved a few random things inside, and left. He didn't bother locking the door. He walked through the city for nearly an hour, past empty parking lots, past closed grocery stores, past flickering streetlights and silent apartment buildings. Eventually, he reached the covered flea market district near the rail yard. At night, it was deserted. Plastic tarps flapped in the cold wind. Old metal stands rattled softly. The smell of burned oil and wet concrete filled the air. Jason kept walking until he reached a small parking lot behind the train tracks. Cars stood scattered across the asphalt. Old sedans, rusty trucks. Nothing expensive. Perfect. Jason knew how to drive, but he hadn't owned a car for over a year. His old station wagon had died, and fixing the engine had cost more than the vehicle itself. Now, he walked slowly between the parked cars, studying them, choosing. He needed something ordinary, invisible. Then he saw it. A faded gray Toyota sedan. Old, forgettable. Exactly what he wanted. Jason leaned against the hood and waited. About 10 minutes later, a man appeared from behind the market stalls. Middle-aged, oil-stained jacket, greasy hands. Clearly a mechanic finishing a late shift. The man unlocked the car and opened the driver's door. Jason stepped forward. "Sorry," he said calmly. The man turned. Jason pulled the rifle from his backpack, the same one he had taken earlier from the police officer during the mall incident. "I need your car." The mechanic's face went pale instantly. Jason kept his voice steady. "Think of it as borrowing." The man slowly raised his hands and stepped away from the car without saying a word. Within seconds, Jason was in the driver's seat. The engine started smoothly. He pulled out of the parking lot and merged into traffic, calmly. No speeding, no sudden moves. Just another car driving through the city. At the first intersection, a loud horn blasted behind him. Jason glanced into the rearview mirror. A brand new SUV sat inches behind his bumper. Inside were 2 people, a bearded man in expensive clothes and a woman wearing oversized sunglasses, even though it was night. The man waved his arms aggressively. "Move!" he shouted through the windshield.
Jason drove forward when the light changed. The SUV stayed glued to his bumper, high beams blinding him through the mirror. The road opened onto a wider avenue. Jason accelerated. The SUV followed. 80 miles per hour, still there. Jason's jaw tightened. A slow anger began spreading through his chest. He changed lanes to the right. The pavement there was rough, potholes everywhere. Suddenly, the Toyota jolted violently. A loud pop echoed. The rear tire blew out. The car swerved, but Jason kept control. Behind him, the SUV honked again, loud, aggressive. Jason gripped the steering wheel. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see how tough you are." He slammed the gas pedal. The damaged car roared forward. The SUV followed immediately. 200 yards later, Jason jerked the wheel and rammed the SUV's rear bumper. Metal crashed. Both vehicles screeched to a halt in the middle of the road. Steam hissed from the Toyota's engine. Jason stepped out calmly. The SUV doors flew open. The bearded driver stormed toward him. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted. "Do you have any idea what you just hit?" Jason shrugged. "A car," he said. The woman stepped out behind the driver. "You're finished," she snapped. "We're calling the police." The driver shoved Jason in the chest. "License, insurance, now!" Jason looked at him for a moment, then spoke quietly. "You financed that thing, didn't you?" The driver blinked. "What?" "You think owning a fancy car makes you important," Jason continued. "But you're just another idiot with a loan." The driver's face twisted with rage. He swung his fist. Jason moved faster. From the Toyota's door pocket, he grabbed a short screwdriver. The metal flashed upward. The driver screamed. The screwdriver buried itself just below his collarbone. Blood poured down his jacket. The woman shrieked, "You psycho!" The driver stumbled backward toward the SUV, ripping the screwdriver free. He yanked a folding knife from his pocket. "You're dead," he roared. He charged. Jason opened the Toyota's back door. The rifle slid into his hands. 2 quick bursts. Gunshots cracked through the empty street. The driver collapsed instantly. Both knees shattered. The woman screamed as another bullet tore through her leg. Silence returned. Jason walked toward them slowly. The driver lay on the asphalt, clutching his ruined legs. The woman cried beside the SUV, shaking uncontrollably. Jason crouched between them. "Here's a free lesson," he said calmly. "Being important doesn't come from money." He picked up the woman's phone from the ground. She had been recording. Jason deleted the video, then tossed the phone back to her. "Call an ambulance," he said. He stood up. "Try not to be idiots next time." Jason grabbed the SUV keys from the man's shaking hand, then climbed into the expensive vehicle. The engine purred quietly. He drove away, leaving the Toyota and the 2 bleeding strangers behind. 20 minutes later, Jason parked near the Federal Immigration Services building downtown. The large concrete structure loomed silently under dim streetlights. Jason stared at the entrance. Inside that building might be the only lead he had left. Emily. If she really had moved overseas like she once planned, there would be records. Jason stepped out of the SUV and walked toward the doors. For the first time in weeks, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope. But he didn't know someone else had already been watching him. And they were waiting. Jason entered the immigration building quietly. The lobby was crowded despite the late hour. Lines of tired people stretched along the walls. Some sat on windowsills. Others leaned against pillars, clutching folders of documents. Different languages filled the air. Russian, Arabic, Spanish, English spoken with thick accents.
The place smelled like cheap coffee and overheated radiators. Jason walked past the security scanner without drawing attention and climbed the stairs to the second floor. A row of service windows stretched across the hall. Above them hung flickering digital numbers. Window number 7 had no line. Behind the glass sat a young woman in a government uniform. Light brown hair tied back, tired eyes, the look of someone who had worked too many late shifts. Jason stepped forward. "Good evening," he said. She glanced up. "How can I help you?" "I'm looking for someone," Jason replied calmly. She shook her head immediately. "We don't do missing persons." "I understand," he said, leaning slightly closer to the glass. "I only need confirmation that she's alive." The woman sighed. "That's still not something we provide." Jason lowered his voice. "I have an old phone number and passport information. She left the country years ago." "No," she said more firmly. "Personal data is protected." Jason remained still. "You have access to the database," he said quietly. Her eyes narrowed. "If you don't step away, I'm calling security." Jason didn't move. "Go ahead." Something in his tone made her pause. He continued calmly. "I'm not looking for a criminal. I'm trying to find the woman I was supposed to marry." The woman studied his face for a long moment. Finally, she sighed again. "Fine," she muttered. "Quickly." Her fingers began typing across the keyboard. The monitor's light reflected in her glasses as lines of data appeared. She scrolled through several screens. "Old passport record. Here," she said quietly. "She renewed it abroad." Jason's heart beat faster. "Where?" "France," she said. "Residence registration about a year ago." Jason leaned closer. "Can you print it?" "No." "Then write it down." The woman hesitated.
Then quickly scribbled 2 lines of information on a small piece of paper, a passport number and a registration code. She slid it under the glass. "You didn't get this from me." Jason folded the paper. "Thank you." He turned and walked toward the stairs, but something felt wrong. When he reached the lobby, he saw them. 2 men standing near the entrance, black jackets, earpieces. Outside, through the glass doors, several dark vehicles waited in the parking lot, unmarked. Jason slowed. Too late. "Alexei Levitsky?" The voice came from behind him. Jason turned. 4 men in tactical vests were already moving down the stairs. "Come with us." Jason raised an eyebrow. "What's this about?" "Routine verification," the lead agent said. "Don't make it difficult." They grabbed his arms and forced them behind his back. Metal handcuffs clicked into place. Several people in the lobby gasped. The clerk from Window 7 peeked around the corner, then quickly disappeared. "I'm not resisting," Jason said calmly. No one answered. They pushed him outside. Cold night air hit his face. A black van waited with its rear doors open. Jason was shoved inside. The doors slammed shut. The van drove for nearly 30 minutes. Jason sat silently with his hands cuffed. Across from him sat an older man in a gray suit, sharp features, calm eyes. Finally, the man spoke. "You're not the first one," he said. Jason looked up. "First what?" "First like you." The van turned sharply. The sound of tires on asphalt changed to the hollow echo of concrete. They were entering an underground garage. Jason frowned. "What are you talking about?" The man smiled faintly. "People who don't die." Jason said nothing. The van stopped. They dragged him out and led him through a series of reinforced doors, down long white corridors. Finally, into a room with no windows. A metal table stood in the center. Bright surgical lights hung above it. "This is temporary,"
the man in the suit said.
Until we figure out what you are.
Jason looked directly at him. And you are? Someone who studies anomalies, the man replied. You mean monsters? The man smiled again. Same thing, depending on perspective. Jason leaned back in the chair. Then you're about to learn something interesting. The man tilted his head. Oh? Jason's eyes glinted. Let's see which one of us leaves this room. The agent chuckled softly. You're not leaving anywhere. He walked toward the door. Not quickly, anyway. The heavy door slammed shut. The lights buzzed overhead. Jason sat alone, listening to the faint hum of ventilation systems in the walls. And for the first time since his transformation, he felt something new. Not fear, not anger, anticipation. Because something deep inside him knew one thing. This place had no idea what they had just captured. The room had no windows, gray concrete walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, one bright surgical lamp hanging from the ceiling. Jason sat in the chair, his hands still locked in steel cuffs. The humming ventilation system was the only sound. Minutes passed. Then the door opened. 3 people entered, 2 guards in tactical gear, and the same gray-haired man in the suit. Behind them came 2 technicians in white lab coats pushing a cart filled with instruments, scalpels, syringes, medical scanners. Jason raised an eyebrow. Well, he said calmly, this looks promising. The gray-haired man placed a folder on the table. Subject, Jason Miller, he read. Former factory worker, no criminal history until 3 weeks ago. He looked up. But since then, quite impressive. Jason leaned back slightly. You've been watching me. Of course, the man replied. He opened the folder. The cemetery incident. 3 missing homeless men. Jason said nothing. The apartment murders. Still silence. The mall robbery. 2 injured officers. The man closed the file. And the highway shooting tonight. He folded his hands. You've had a busy month. Jason shrugged. You should see my weekends. One of the technicians approached with a syringe. Jason watched calmly as the needle slid into his arm. The liquid burned through his veins, a powerful sedative. Within seconds, his muscles relaxed. His vision blurred, but he stayed conscious. The gray-haired man noticed. Interesting, he murmured. The technicians began attaching sensors to Jason's chest. Monitors flickered alive. Heart rate, blood pressure, neural activity. The machines beeped softly. One of the technicians frowned. Sir, these readings don't make sense. The man stepped closer to the monitor. Jason smiled faintly. What's wrong? The technician swallowed. His heart stopped. The room went silent. Jason looked down at his chest. The monitor showed a flat line. No heartbeat. But he was still breathing, still awake, still smiling. The gray-haired man's expression hardened. Begin phase 2. One of the guards approached with a metal tray. On it lay a surgical saw. Jason raised an eyebrow. You're going to cut me open? The man nodded. We already did. Jason blinked. What? You've been here for 6 days, the man said calmly. Jason frowned. That's impossible. You've died 14 times. The technicians exchanged nervous glances. The man continued. Every time your body rebuilt itself. Jason's smile slowly faded. Images flickered in his mind. Flashes of pain, bright lights, cold metal, voices arguing somewhere far away. Once we removed part of your brain, the man added quietly. Jason's stomach twisted. You're lying.
We wanted to see if the regeneration would rebuild neural tissue. The man leaned closer. It did. Jason stared at him. For the first time since the cemetery, he felt something cold inside his chest. Not fear. Rage. The man straightened. Unfortunately, we still don't understand the mechanism. He gestured toward the technicians. So we will continue. The saw started. Its blade whined loudly.
One of the guards stepped forward. Jason suddenly began laughing. Loud, wild. The guards froze. The gray-haired man watched carefully. "You think this hurts?" Jason asked. The man tilted his head. "Doesn't it?" Jason grinned. "No." The saw blade touched his chest. Bone cracked. Blood splashed across the table. Jason kept laughing. The technicians stared in disbelief as the wound began closing even while they were cutting. The gray-haired man whispered softly, "Remarkable." Then, a distant scream echoed through the corridor. Everyone paused. Another scream followed, then a gunshot. The lights flickered. The technicians looked at each other. "What was that?" More screams, closer now. Something heavy crashed somewhere outside. Then silence. The gray-haired man slowly turned toward the door. The guard raised his rifle. The door creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway. A woman. Short, dark hair, black uniform torn and covered in blood. In her hand, she carried something long and white. Jason squinted. It took him a moment to realize what it was. A human spine. The woman stepped into the room. She casually tossed the spine onto the floor. "Well," she said, "this place was unpleasant." The guards raised their weapons. They didn't even finish aiming. The woman moved. Her hand punched straight through the first guard's chest. The second guard fired. The bullet hit her shoulder. She barely noticed. 2 seconds later, both men lay dead on the floor. The technicians tried to run. She caught them before they reached the door. The room became silent again. Only the hum of the lights remained. Blood pooled across the white tiles. The gray-haired man stood frozen. The woman looked at him calmly. "You people never learn," she said. Then she snapped his neck with one quick movement. The body collapsed. Jason stared. The woman wiped her hands on the dead guard's jacket. Then she looked at Jason. "Hello again." She walked over and pulled the restraints apart like they were paper. Jason slowly sat up. "You," he said quietly. She dragged a metal stool across the floor and sat down in front of him, crossing one leg over the other. The smell of blood filled the room. Jason looked around. "You killed everyone?" She shrugged. "More or less." Jason rubbed his wrists, then looked at her again. "What am I?" She smiled faintly. "Not what you think." Jason frowned. "Then what?" She lit a cigarette, took a slow drag. "I'm a vampire," she said calmly. Jason blinked. "And you," she exhaled smoke, "are something much worse." The concrete cell smelled of disinfectant and dried blood. Jason sat on the cold floor, naked, thin, and pale under the flickering light. The lab had taken everything from him during the week he'd been there. His clothes, his dignity, pieces of his body, sometimes even his brain. And every time he came back, they had cut him open, burned him, injected chemicals into his veins. He remembered the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth while someone said, "Impossible, he's still alive." Then darkness. Then waking up again, rebuilt, repaired, whole. 7 days of it. By the time the woman appeared in the doorway, Jason no longer felt fear, only emptiness and curiosity. She stepped inside the ruined laboratory, dragging the metal stool across the floor. Behind her, the corridor was silent now.
Everyone else in the facility was dead. The woman sat down casually in front of him, crossing her legs. Blood still dripped slowly from the sleeve of her torn black jacket. "Well," she said calmly, "looks like you had a rough week." Jason leaned back against the wall. "You killed them all." She shrugged. "They were annoying." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jason asked the question that had been burning inside him since the cemetery. "What am I?" The woman watched him carefully. Her red lipstick looked almost black under the fluorescent light. "You're not a vampire," she said finally. Jason frowned. "But you are." She nodded.
Yes. She flicked ash from her cigarette. But you're something else. Jason waited. The woman leaned forward slightly. "When I gave you my blood that night, I wasn't trying to create anything," she explained. "You were dying. I simply didn't want to watch it happen." "Why?" She smiled faintly. "You survived longer than the others." Jason's eyes narrowed. "The others?" "The men before you," she said calmly. "I tried the same thing with them." Jason felt something twist in his stomach. "They died?" "Immediately." She shrugged again. "But you didn't." The cigarette smoke curled slowly between them. "That means your body reacted differently." Jason looked down at his hands. "So, what does that make me?" The woman took another drag from the cigarette. "A hybrid," she said. "Half human. Half something very old." Jason let out a dry laugh. "Great." She tilted her head. "Don't celebrate yet." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "Because you can still die." He stared at her. "What?" "In the old days," she continued calmly, "vampires could only be killed with silver." She gestured toward the ruined lab around them. "But the world changed. Now humans have lasers, radiation, plasma weapons, nuclear bombs." Her voice remained almost casual. "My cousin was destroyed during the Soviet era. They strapped him to a rocket and launched him into orbit." Jason blinked. She shrugged. "Problem solved." Jason sat quietly for a long moment. "So they're not hunting you anymore?" "No," she said. "People stopped believing in monsters." She stood up slowly. "That's why we survive." Jason looked up at her. "What about me?" She walked toward the door. "You do whatever you want." "That's the beauty of it." He hesitated. "What if they catch me again?" She glanced back. "Then don't let them." Jason frowned. "They said they captured 2 others like me." The woman paused. Her expression hardened slightly. "Yes." "What happened to them?" "They got caught twice." She opened the door. "So I killed them." Jason said nothing. The hallway outside was dark now. Before leaving, the woman looked at him one last time. "Try not to attract attention." She smiled slightly. "If you survive 200 years, maybe I'll tell you how to become a real vampire." Then she stepped into the darkness and disappeared. Years passed. So many years that Jason's old life began to feel like a story he had once heard about someone else. Factories closed. Cities changed. Governments rose and fell. Jason remained the same. He wandered across countries under different names, learning how to exist quietly. He avoided attention, avoided violence, most of the time. But there was one thing he never stopped searching for: Emily. It took him almost 12 years, but one afternoon in a small cafe in Prague, he saw her again. She was sitting near the window, older now, her blonde hair touched with silver. But her smile was exactly the same.
At first, she didn't recognize him. Jason had changed his appearance many times. Different hair, different clothes, different posture. But when he spoke her name, something in her eyes softened. He didn't tell her everything, just enough. That he had been sick, that he had disappeared for a long time, that he had lost contact with everyone. And somehow, that was enough. They built a quiet life together, a small house near the edge of the city. Evenings spent drinking tea in the garden, watching snow fall through the trees. Emily grew older. Jason didn't. He learned how to hide it. Gray hair dye, fake wrinkles, a slight stoop when he walked. He had always been afraid of one thing: children. What if they inherited whatever he had become? But life had other plans. 2 sons and a daughter, all perfectly normal, human. Years turned into decades. Then one winter morning, Emily held his hand in the hospital bed and smiled weakly. "I always knew something was different about you," she whispered. Jason said nothing.
But I was never afraid. Her fingers squeezed his. I just didn't want you to be alone. She died that evening while snow fell outside the window. Jason buried her himself beneath an old chestnut tree in their garden. No ceremony, no speeches, just the quiet sound of wet earth. After that, the house felt empty. His children visited sometimes. His grandchildren grew up. Time kept moving. But Jason never changed. One night, he packed a small backpack, a knife, a map, a few old photographs. He left a short letter behind. "Don't look for me. I'm okay. It's just time." Before leaving, he kissed the cold stone above Emily's grave. Then he walked away, across cities, across countries, across decades. The world became louder, faster, stranger. But Jason kept moving. Sometimes, in his dreams, he saw her again, the woman from the cemetery, sitting on a metal stool, smoking, smiling. "Well?" she would ask. "Did you figure out why I saved you?" Jason never answered. He simply looked into her eyes, because somewhere out there, she was still alive. And one day he would find her, not for revenge, not for anger, just for the answer. Jason walked down a dark road beneath the endless sky and left no footprints behind.